The loud wail of sirens filled the air as the flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. The officer's hands tightened around the woman's wrist, pulling her out of the car. "You're under arrest," he yelled, his voice full of anger. The crowd around them began to murmur, some pulling out their phones to record the moment. But the woman, unshaken, stood tall, her eyes burning with determination. She didn't seem afraid. There was something different about her. What happens next will not only ruin his career, it will send shockwaves through the entire justice system. Dr. Valerie Adams was a successful black entrepreneur and a well-known activist. She had spent years fighting for the rights of marginalized communities, using her influence to bring about change. Her work had touched the lives of many, and she had earned a reputation as one of the strongest voices in civil rights. One peaceful afternoon, Dr. Adams was driving through a quiet suburban street when she was suddenly pulled over by Officer Mitchell. Mitchell wasn't just any cop. He had a reputation for targeting people of color, often pulling them over for reasons that seemed questionable at best. Mitchell stepped out of his car, his eyes narrowing as he approached her window. "License and registration," he barked, his voice cold and dismissive. Dr. Adams calmly reached for her papers, but before she could hand them to him, Mitchell spoke again. "I know what you are," he sneered. "You've got a record, don't you?" Dr. Adams paused, but her voice remained steady. "I've been pulled over without cause. I've done nothing wrong." Mitchell ignored her words, his tone growing more aggressive. "I'm asking for your ID. Show it to me now." Dr. Adams refused to back down. "I'm not complying with unreasonable demands," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving his. The officer's face reddened. He wasn't used to being challenged. He moved quickly, grabbing Dr. Adams's arm and yanking her from the car, his grip rough and forceful. The growing crowd around them began to murmur. Phones were raised, and people whispered to each other about what was happening. "Racial profiling," someone said. Mitchell, now furious, pushed Dr. Adams toward the back of his squad car, practically throwing her inside. But just as he was about to close the door, someone in the crowd shouted her name. The woman they had been watching was no ordinary person. Dr. Valerie Adams was one of the most influential civil rights figures in the country, a leader who had spent her life fighting for justice. Mitchell's arrogance froze. His face drained of color as he realized the monumental mistake he had just made. He wasn't arresting just anyone. He had just arrested a legend. Within minutes of Dr. Valerie Adams being arrested, the situation began to spiral out of control for Officer Mitchell. The crowd grew larger by the second as people started to gather, their phones out, recording the entire scene. Some were chanting, others were questioning Mitchell's authority, and it was clear from their voices that this wasn't just about Dr. Adams. It was about the years of unjust treatment that so many others had endured. As the crowd murmured, word spread, and the video of Dr. Adams's arrest quickly found its way to social media. By the time the arresting officer had closed the door of his squad car, the video had already been shared thousands of times. People across the country were watching. The backlash against Officer Mitchell intensified with every second. Comments poured in, condemning him for his actions. The video went viral, fueling outrage in every corner of the internet. Within minutes, Dr. Adams's legal team arrived on the scene. The first to step out of the car was Avery Franklin, a well-known civil rights lawyer who had dedicated his career to fighting for racial justice. Right behind him was Judge Helen Owens, a former judge who had worked alongside Dr. Adams on several high-profile cases. And trailing close behind was Maxine Carter, a media strategist known for taking down corrupt systems and amplifying the voices of the oppressed. The three of them approached Dr. Adams's car, where Mitchell was still standing, seemingly unsure of what to do. The entire crowd was watching. It wasn't just a regular arrest anymore. This was turning into a national event. Avery Franklin stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Officer Mitchell, you need to release her immediately. You're detaining a person who has done nothing wrong." Mitchell turned toward Franklin, trying to stand his ground. "She was resisting authority. I had no choice." "That's a lie, Mitchell, and you know it." Franklin's voice was sharp now. "You know exactly who she is, don't you?" Mitchell hesitated, shifting uncomfortably, but he didn't respond. Judge Owen stepped forward, her voice cool and steady, but laced with authority. "This is not about your authority, officer. This is about you abusing power, plain and simple." The crowd was growing louder. People were shouting, recording, and getting more vocal about Mitchell's behavior. A few shouted things like, "Release her," and "This is racial profiling." The tension in the air was palpable. As the crowd continued to grow, Mitchell began to sweat, his hands visibly shaking. But he refused to back down. "She resisted. I was doing my job," Mitchell insisted, his voice growing increasingly defensive. "No, you weren't, Mitchell. You were abusing your power," Judge Owen shot back. The camera flashes from the crowd intensified as the truth began to surface. Dr. Adams remained calm throughout it all, but her team was furious. They knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. They knew that this officer was just one part of a broken system. Meanwhile, people in the crowd were demanding Mitchell's job. Some questioned the legitimacy of the police's motives, while others had already turned their phones toward the police station. They weren't going to let this go. The video was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. Mitchell stood at the center of it all, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of control, but he could feel his world crumbling around him. The pressure was mounting. He could sense his reputation slipping. Dr. Adams's team wasn't just going to let this slide. They had spent years gathering information, not just about Mitchell, but about the system that protected officers like him. Avery Franklin started digging deeper, quickly revealing more about Mitchell's past. He was no stranger to complaints. Multiple racial profiling incidents, allegations of excessive force, and a pattern of unjust arrests followed him wherever he went. As the story unfolded, Dr. Adams's team unleashed the truth. Mitchell wasn't just a random bad apple. He was part of a larger pattern of abuse, enabled by a corrupt department that had turned a blind eye. The truth was out. Mitchell had been allowed to get away with it for far too long. As the media began to cover the story, the national outrage grew. News outlets picked up the video and began showing the arrest, the confrontation, and the immediate reactions from the crowd. Mitchell was becoming a symbol of everything wrong with the system. The pressure was building, and soon local and national leaders began to speak out. Dr. Adams wasn't just a well-known activist. The big reveal was that she had influential political ties, with connections to high-level officials in the government, including close ties to the president's administration. The news hit like a bombshell. Suddenly, the situation became much bigger than a simple case of police misconduct. The eyes of the nation were on Mitchell and his department, and the stakes had never been higher. Mitchell stood there, now realizing just how grave his mistake was. Dr. Adams wasn't just a random individual. She was a mover and shaker in the fight for racial justice. He had just tried to arrest one of the most powerful figures in the movement, and now the world would see his bigotry exposed. As the realization sank in, Mitchell's arrogance began to fade. His fear set in as the camera flashes and the crowd's murmurs grew louder. He had made a critical error, and the consequences were about to rain down on him. The tension in the air was thick, electric, as Officer Mitchell stood at the center of the crowd, sweating profusely, trying to justify his actions. His hands shook as he pointed to Dr. Valerie Adams and shouted, "She resisted. I had no choice. I'm just doing my job." His voice cracked with desperation, but the more he spoke, the more agitated he became. The crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen enough. "You're not doing your job. You're abusing your power," someone from the crowd yelled. Phones flashed, recording everything, capturing his every movement, his every word. It wasn't just a fight between him and Dr. Adams. This was the public against the system that had allowed him to act with such impunity for so long. Mitchell's frustration grew as his fear became more visible. He tried to shout louder, attempting to drown out the growing calls of outrage from the crowd, but the voices only got stronger. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you, officer?" came a shout from the back. "This isn't the first time you've targeted an innocent person?" Mitchell's heart raced, his mind scrambled for an explanation. Dr. Adams's team, composed of some of the most powerful lawyers in the country, was relentless. Avery Franklin, the civil rights lawyer, stepped forward. His voice was calm, but every word was like a punch to Mitchell's defense. "Officer Mitchell, this isn't an isolated incident. Your record is full of complaints." Judge Helen Owens, once Dr. Adams's legal ally, added, "You've been part of a network of officers abusing your power to target minorities and cover up your misdeeds. You are part of a corrupt system, and today that system ends." The words hit like a bombshell. Mitchell's face drained of color. His actions weren't just wrong, they were part of something much bigger. It wasn't just him, it was the system, the officers that protected him, the department that turned a blind eye, the systemic racism that allowed men like him to think they were above the law. The crowd began to shift. What started as murmurs of disbelief turned into shouts of anger and disgust. People started to turn on Mitchell, demanding his job, his badge, his freedom. "This is it. He's done," one of the protesters screamed. "He's been doing this for years," another person shouted, their voice filled with fury. Mitchell's eyes flickered nervously, looking for an escape, but there was no way out. The walls were closing in. The crowd was turning on him. The media cameras kept rolling, amplifying the pressure. In that moment of panic, Dr. Adams stepped forward, her calm presence cutting through the noise. The crowd fell silent, sensing that she was about to speak. Dr. Adams took a deep breath and, with a powerful clarity, began. "I've spent my whole life fighting this system that teaches people like Officer Mitchell that their badge gives them the right to abuse their power without consequence. This system that looks the other way when people like him hurt others simply because of the color of their skin." Her voice rose with strength. "I've fought for justice for my entire life, and I will not allow someone like him to continue using his badge to hurt innocent people. This isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who have been hurt by this system, the ones who didn't have a camera to expose the truth." The crowd stood there in complete silence, hanging on her every word. Dr. Adams had just turned the tide, and now the atmosphere shifted. People weren't just watching an arrest, they were watching a movement. She finished, "I won't let him walk free. Not this time." At that exact moment, a police car screeched to a halt near the crowd, and Chief Reynolds stepped out, visibly furious. He stormed toward Officer Mitchell, his face a mixture of anger and disappointment. "What the hell's going on here, Mitchell?" The chief's voice was low, but filled with authority. He motioned for the officers around him to take a closer look at the video that had gone viral. As Mitchell stood there, his defense crumbling, the chief began reviewing the footage. Mitchell, now realizing the enormity of his mistake, tried to speak up, stammering, "Sir, I had no choice. She—" But before he could finish, the surprise came. Judge Owens stepped forward, holding a letter that she handed to the chief. It was official. Doctor. Adams's legal team had already secured Mitchell's suspension and firing on the spot. "Effective immediately, Officer Mitchell, you are relieved of your duties." The chief's voice was cold as he stripped Mitchell of his badge. The crowd exploded in cheers. Mitchell's face fell, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. The reality of the situation hit him. He was done. Cliffhanger. As the chief moved to lead Mitchell away, one final voice shouted from the crowd, "This is just the beginning." The battle wasn't over. It had only just started. The fight for justice was now on a bigger stage than ever. The day after Officer Mitchell's firing, the storm that had begun outside the police station continued to rage. Dr. Valerie Adams' legal team wasn't just satisfied with getting Mitchell dismissed. They knew that the real battle had just begun. They pushed for a full investigation into his actions, certain that his misconduct wasn't just the result of one officer's bad decisions. The system that allowed Mitchell to operate without consequences for so long needed to be exposed. The first cracks in the dam began to show when more officers came forward, seemingly spurred on by the pressure from the public and the growing calls for justice. The floodgates opened when one officer, a mid-level member of the force, contacted Dr. Adams' team anonymously. He had witnessed Mitchell's racism firsthand, but had been too afraid to speak out earlier. This officer was the first to admit that Mitchell had regularly targeted people of color for no reason other than their race. He described how Mitchell had used his position to intimidate and silence anyone who questioned him, including fellow officers. "I couldn't do anything," the officer confessed. "I was afraid of what would happen if I spoke up. Mitchell had friends in high places. He was untouchable." This revelation was the first crack in what was now becoming a massive web of corruption within the police department. Dr. Adams' team began their work in earnest, digging deeper into Mitchell's background and his connections within the department. As the investigation grew, more officers started to come forward, revealing that Mitchell wasn't the only one abusing his power. In fact, his actions had been part of a wider network of officers who were exploiting their positions for personal gain. Some of these officers admitted to covering up Mitchell's actions, effectively allowing him to continue his racist practices for years. One officer, a veteran with decades of service, told the team, "We all knew what was going on. Mitchell was protected. We just kept quiet because we knew if we spoke up, we'd be next." The more they dug, the more Dr. Adams and her team began to uncover hidden patterns of abuse that spanned years. It wasn't just Mitchell's behavior that had been overlooked. It was the entire culture within the department that allowed officers like him to operate without fear of being held accountable. The team discovered that internal investigations had been shut down repeatedly, and complaints about Mitchell's racial profiling had been filed and ignored. Higher-ups in the department had not only turned a blind eye to his actions, but had actively protected him, hiding his abuses from the public. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated issue. It was systemic. As the investigation gathered momentum, the media began to pounce. News outlets from across the country started to cover Mitchell's firing, and his name quickly became synonymous with police brutality. Journalists picked up the story, running investigative pieces on Mitchell's history and the department's role in shielding him from scrutiny. Dr. Adams' team, with their unparalleled media strategy, worked to keep the story at the forefront. Avery Franklin, the civil rights lawyer, appeared on television shows, pointing out how Mitchell was just a part of the problem and how the entire police system needed to be overhauled. Meanwhile, Judge Helen Owens pressed for full transparency, demanding that every officer involved in covering up Mitchell's actions be investigated. The media hounded Mitchell as he became the face of the police corruption scandal. The public pressure mounted, and leaders from across the country began to weigh in. Some called for a complete overhaul of the department, while others urged for an end to qualified immunity, the legal protection that allowed officers to avoid punishment for misconduct. Just when it seemed like Mitchell's fate was sealed, A twist came in the form of a whistleblower from within the department. A senior officer who had been involved in Mitchell's protection came forward with shocking new information. Mitchell wasn't just protected by the department. He had ties to people far above us, the officer began, but the rest of his statement was cut off. The officer's testimony was incomplete, and as Dr. Adams's team pieced together the details, it became clear that the higher-ups Mitchell had been working with were more powerful than they could have imagined. The confession sparked a new wave of investigation. Who had been protecting Mitchell? Who were the corrupt officials pulling the strings behind the scenes? As the investigation deepened, it became clearer that Mitchell wasn't the only officer involved in the corruption. He was simply the tip of the iceberg. Dr. Adams's team began to uncover even more damning evidence, revealing a systemic problem within the department that stretched back for decades. Mitchell had been allowed to continue his racist behavior because he was shielded by a network of officers, supervisors, and officials who were equally guilty of racism and abuse of power. The more they found, the more the team realized that the battle wasn't just against Mitchell. It was against an entire system of corruption that needed to be dismantled. But the fight wasn't over yet. The whistleblower's incomplete information had left the team with more questions than answers. They knew they were getting closer to the truth, but the deeper they went, the more dangerous the situation became. Would they be able to expose the full extent of the corruption before it was buried once again? The stakes were higher than ever, and Dr. Adams's resolve grew stronger. This fight wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had been hurt by this system. It was for those who had been silenced. The truth was going to come out, and they wouldn't stop until it did. The investigation had reached its peak. Every piece of evidence, every testimony had led to this moment. Dr. Valerie Adams and her team had worked tirelessly, peeling back layers of corruption, exposing the truth bit by bit. Now it was time for the final confrontation, and Mitchell would no longer be able to hide. Dr. Adams stood in front of a crowd of reporters, her face calm but determined. Her team stood behind her, knowing that this was the moment they had all been working toward. Officer Mitchell's involvement in the corruption within the department was about to be fully exposed. The charges were read aloud: racial discrimination, abuse of power, and the deliberate attempt to cover up his past crimes. The weight of the accusation shook Mitchell to his core. The entire system that had protected him was now unraveling. He was no longer the untouchable officer he had once been. He was facing accountability. Dr. Adams had always known this day would come, the day when Mitchell would face the consequences of his actions. What she didn't expect, however, was the level of public outcry that followed. Mitchell's story wasn't just the story of a single bad cop, it was the story of a broken system. And now it was time for that system to be rebuilt. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Mitchell stood in front of a courtroom full of reporters, looking like a man who had lost everything. His mugshot was plastered on every news outlet, his name becoming synonymous with police brutality and abuse of power. He tried to maintain some semblance of pride, but the shame was overwhelming. His actions, his deep involvement in a corrupt network of officers, had been revealed for all to see. The shame of it weighed on him as the media hounded him, asking the questions he couldn't answer. The emotional toll on Mitchell was clear. This wasn't just a matter of losing his job, it was losing everything he had built. The friendships, the power, the privilege, all gone. As Mitchell was led away in handcuffs, a wave of relief washed over Dr. Adams and her team. They had fought for so long, and now justice was finally being served. But Mitchell's fall was only part of the story. Dr. Adams had bigger plans. plans that would spark a nationwide movement for police reform. Her team's work had exposed the deep-rooted corruption within the department, but it had also inspired a call for change that echoed across the country. People were beginning to demand accountability, not just from Mitchell, but from the entire system. As Dr. Adams stood in front of a crowd of thousands, her speech on national television reached millions. "This is not just about me," she said, her voice steady and powerful. "This is about every person who has been targeted, harassed, or hurt by a system that is supposed to protect us. This is about ensuring that no one is above the law." The audience erupted in applause and the movement gained traction. Dr. Adams wasn't just a victim of injustice. She had become a symbol of what fighting back could achieve. She wasn't going to stop until there was real change in the system. The governor stepped up, signing into law new regulations for police accountability. These regulations were designed to prevent the kind of abuses that had led to Mitchell's behavior. From now on, every police officer would be held accountable for their actions, and any instance of racial profiling or excessive force would be thoroughly investigated. Dr. Adams's influence was undeniable. Her tireless work had shaken the system to its core and forced the government to take real action. The signing of the new law was a turning point for police reform across the country. As the ink dried on the new regulations, Mitchell's public humiliation began. The man who had once been a symbol of unchecked authority was now a cautionary tale. His name would forever be associated with the abuse of power. He was shunned by his peers. His colleagues who once protected him now turned their backs, and he became a symbol of corruption, a warning to anyone who thought they could get away with mistreating others. In the end, Mitchell's downfall wasn't just about one man. It was about changing the system. The reforms set in motion by Dr. Adams and her team marked the beginning of a new era in policing, one where officers would be held accountable and communities of color would no longer have to live in fear of those who were supposed to protect them. As the camera focused on Dr. Adams standing in front of a crowd of supporters, her speech rang out one last time. "This is just the beginning. We have a long way to go, but today we've taken the first step toward justice." It was clear now. The fight for justice had been won, not by one woman, but by an entire movement. As the dust settled and the dust of Mitchell's downfall settled, justice prevailed. The once untouchable officer was fired from his position, arrested, and now faced serious legal consequences for the years of abuse, discrimination, and corruption he had been part of. His career was over, but more importantly, the message was loud and clear. No one is above the law. Dr. Valerie Adams and her team were hailed as heroes across the country. Their tireless work had not only exposed the depths of police corruption, but had also sparked a revolutionary movement for reform. But their work was far from finished. This victory was just the beginning of a larger, more important fight. The city's policies began to change immediately. Body cameras were implemented across the entire police department, ensuring that officers could no longer act with impunity. Bias training became mandatory, making sure that future generations of officers would be taught to uphold justice, not perpetuate discrimination. But the impact didn't stop there. Communities around the country saw what had happened in Dr. Adams's case and began to demand similar reforms in their own cities. The momentum for police accountability spread like wildfire, and soon the conversation shifted nationwide. People were no longer willing to turn a blind eye to police brutality. They were fighting for real change. Dr. Adams, once a victim of the system, had now become a champion for civil rights and police accountability. Her legacy was cemented as one of the most important voices in the fight for justice. As she stood at the front of the crowd watching people take to the streets demanding their rights, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Change was happening. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much to be done, but this victory proved that fighting for what's right could lead to real transformation. The story of Dr. Adams and Officer Mitchell ended on a hopeful note, with Dr. Adams looking ahead, knowing that the road ahead was long, but that every victory brought them one step closer to a world of justice, equality, and accountability. She wasn't going to stop. Her mission wasn't over, but she could rest knowing that, for the first time in a long time, justice had truly been served, and the future was full of hope. Her work for justice would continue, and with every victory, change would come, one victory at a time. Before I tell you where Mitchell ended up, hit that subscribe button, because you won't believe what happens to him next. Trust me, the final twist will leave you speechless. Make sure you don't miss out on the shocking ending.